October 1957. Sydney, Australia. Little Richard is mid-performance when he looks up at the sky and sees fire. A Soviet satellite, Sputnik, streaking overhead, burning through the atmosphere. Or maybe it's something else. A plane. A sign. In that moment, Richard Wayne Penniman decides that God is calling him home. He walks off stage, mid-tour, mid-song. Within days, he renounces rock and roll. He enrolls in Bible college. He tells anyone who'll listen that the music that made him famous, the screaming, the pounding piano, the sexual electricity, was the devil's work. And yet, sitting in the Specialty Records vault back in Los Angeles, there's a nearly completed album. His most fully realized work yet. Songs already recorded, mixes already done. A follow-up to Here's Little Richard, the album that had made him one of the biggest stars in American music. The label wants to release it. Richard doesn't want to promote it. The industry doesn't know if he's coming back. And the album, The Fabulous Little Richard, becomes a ghost caught between two versions of the same man. This is the story of the record that arrived too late from an artist who left too soon. By 1958, Little Richard wasn't just a rock and roll star. He was the blueprint. Tutti Frutti had rewritten the rules in 1955. Long Tall Sally proved it wasn't a fluke. Songs like Rip It Up and Ready Teddy turned Richard into a phenomenon, not just for white teenagers sneaking contraband records, but for black audiences who'd never seen someone claim that much space, that loudly, on their own terms. Elvis was bigger. Chuck Berry was sharper, but neither had Richard's sheer force. The pompadour, the eyeliner, the raw, uncontainable energy that made every performance feel like it might ignite. Specialty Records knew what they had, and they knew it was burning fast. Rock and roll careers in the 50s didn't last. The industry chewed through talent. Payola scandals were brewing. The church was organizing boycotts. Parents were terrified. Richard himself was becoming more volatile. Stories of excess, of spiritual confusion, of fame eating away at something inside him. So Specialty pushed him back into the studio throughout 1956 and 1957, recording as much material as they could while he was still willing. Songs that would later appear on The Fabulous Little Richard, Shake a Hand, Chicken Little Baby, All Night Long, The Most I Can Offer. But even as they recorded, something was shifting. Richard wasn't singing the same way. There was more gospel creeping into the phrasing, more restraint, more conflict. The man was splitting in two. Richard had always been religious. That's the part people forget. His mother was a church woman. He grew up singing in Pentecostal services in Macon, Georgia, where the Holy Spirit moved through bodies the same way his music would later move through juke joints. The ecstasy was the same. The danger was the same. And for years, Richard lived in both worlds without reconciling them. He'd perform at night, pray in the morning, and tell himself the line between sacred and profane didn't matter as long as the feeling was real. But by 1957, the guilt was winning. Friends later recalled Richard talking about dreams, visions, a growing sense that his success was a trap. In interviews decades later, he described feeling haunted by his queerness, by his vanity, by the way rock and roll had made him both untouchable and completely exposed. The studio sessions for The Fabulous Little Richard captured this. Songs like By the Light of the Silvery Moon, a soft crooning ballad, felt like a different artist entirely. Lonesome and Blue leaned into melancholy instead of fire. Even Good Golly Miss Molly, one of the last great Richard rockers, had a mechanical quality to it, as if he were performing a role he no longer believed in. Bumps Blackwell, his producer, could feel it. The energy in the room wasn't right. Richard was distracted, restless, somewhere else. And then came Australia. Richard later described the Sydney moment as divine intervention, but the people around him saw something more complicated. He'd been on tour for months. The crowds were massive, the performances were legendary, and yet Richard was unraveling. He'd become convinced that the plane he was on, flying between cities, was going to crash. He started giving away jewelry. He threw diamond rings into rivers, believing material wealth was poisoning him. When he saw that light in the sky during the Sydney show, it confirmed what he'd already decided. He didn't just quit. He renounced. Within weeks, Richard was enrolled at Oakwood College, a Seventh-day Adventist institution in Alabama. He cut his hair. He stopped wearing makeup. He started recording gospel music as if rock and roll had never existed. Specialty Records was blindsided. They just finished mixing the fabulous Little Richard. The cover was designed. The sequencing was done. The album was meant to capitalize on Richard's peak. Keep a Knockin' had been a massive hit in 1957, and the label assumed the momentum would carry. But now the artist himself was calling rock and roll the devil's music in interviews. He refused to promote the album. He wouldn't tour. He wouldn't even acknowledge it. The collision wasn't between Richard and a producer, or Richard and a label. It was between Richard and himself. And the album, this collection of some of his most dynamic recordings, became collateral damage. Specialty made a decision. They released the fabulous Little Richard in May 1959 anyway. No artist cooperation, no promotion, no tour, just the music, sent out into a world that no longer had Little Richard in it. The track list was a strange mix. Some of the wildest recordings Richard had ever made. Good Golly Miss Molly, Ooh My Soul, True Fine Mama. Sat alongside slower, more introspective material that felt like a man testing a different identity. Shake a Hand was pure gospel soul. Kansas City was a cover, competent but restrained. The album was fabulous in places, but it lacked coherence. It felt like an archive, not a statement. And without Richard to sell it, the album didn't connect. It charted modestly. Number 17 on the R&B charts, nowhere near the top 10 on the pop side. A few singles were released, but they felt like afterthoughts. The industry had already moved on. Buddy Holly had just died. The payola hearings were tearing apart the first wave of rock and roll. The moment Richard had helped create was closing. And Richard himself? He was in Bible college, pretending none of it had ever happened. The strangest part wasn't the commercial failure, it was the silence. The fabulous Little Richard arrived without context. Fans didn't know if Richard was done forever or just taking a break. The gospel albums he started releasing, God Is Real, Pray Along with Little Richard, were sincere, but they confused the audience that had made him a star. White teenagers who'd screamed for Tutti Frutti didn't know what to do with a man singing hymns. Black audiences, many of whom had always viewed rock and roll with suspicion, weren't sure whether to celebrate his return to the church or mourn the loss of his defiance. Critics didn't know how to review the fabulous Little Richard. Was it a greatest hits compilation? A new album? A farewell? The packaging didn't clarify. Specialty treated it like product, not art. And so the album simply existed. It sold. It circulated. But it didn't land with cultural weight. There was no controversy, no backlash, no reclamation. Just a muted reception for an artist who was no longer present to defend it. The consequence was erasure, not immediate but gradual. Here's Little Richard remained the definitive album. The gospel records became footnotes, and the fabulous Little Richard became a transitional artifact, something record collectors might own, but casual fans would never seek out. Richard stayed away for 3 years, Bible college, gospel tours, preaching. He married a woman, Ernestine Campbell, in a ceremony that felt more like a public declaration of straightness than a romance. He tried to build a life where Little Richard the performer didn't exist, but the industry didn't let him disappear. Specialty kept releasing material from the vaults, compilations, repackages, old singles reissued as new product. And every time a Little Richard song came on the radio, it reminded the world, and Richard himself, of what he'd walked away from. By 1962, the guilt had faded, or maybe the financial pressure became too strong. Richard started performing again, small shows at first, testing whether he could step back into the persona without losing his soul. The audience hadn't forgotten. They wanted the screams, the piano, the chaos, and Richard slowly gave it to them. He never fully reconciled the two sides. For the rest of his life, he'd swing between rock and roll tours and gospel proclamations, between queer visibility and church conservatism, between claiming his legacy and renouncing it. The Fabulous Little Richard became a document of that split. Not the moment he chose one path over the other, but the moment both paths were still visible. It took decades for people to understand what the Fabulous Little Richard actually was. In the 1980s and 90s, as rock historians started digging into the roots of the music, the album gained new attention, not as a commercial success, but as a creative crossroads. Critics began to hear the tension in the performances, the way Richard's voice strained between celebration and confession. Musicians noticed too. Prince in particular cited Little Richard as the archetype for everything he would become. The sexual ambiguity, the genre fluidity, the refusal to be contained, and the Fabulous Little Richard with its mix of raw rock and introspective balladry felt like a preview of that kind of artistic contradiction. Scholars examining queer history in rock and roll found new meaning in Richard's renunciation. Walking away from fame in 1957 wasn't just about religion, it was about survival. The industry had no space for an openly queer black man. The church offered structure. The conversion wasn't just spiritual, it was strategic. And the album, released in the aftermath of that decision, became a time capsule of a man caught between irreconcilable forces. The Fabulous Little Richard didn't define a genre the way Here's Little Richard did, but it did something subtler. It proved that the first wave of rock and roll wasn't just about rebellion, it was about cost. Chuck Berry would go to prison, Jerry Lee Lewis would be blacklisted, Buddy Holly would die in a plane crash, and Little Richard would walk away, unable to reconcile who he was with what the world demanded. The album's influence isn't in the songs themselves, though tracks like Good Golly Miss Molly and Ooh My Soul became standards. It's in the story. The idea that an artist can be too big for their moment, too conflicted for their industry, too human for their myth. Future generations, from David Bowie to Janelle Monáe, would navigate similar terrain. Queerness and blackness and genre-defying creativity have always existed in tension with commercial expectations. Little Richard's 1959 disappearance, and the album that marked it, became a reference point for artists who understood that visibility isn't the same as freedom. Little Richard died in 2020 at 87 in Tennessee. In his final years, he gave conflicting interviews. Sometimes he'd celebrate his rock and roll legacy. Other times he'd call it sinful. He never stopped wrestling with the split. The Fabulous Little Richard remains a strange, essential document. Not his best album, not his most influential, but maybe his most honest. It captured a man at the edge of two identities, two industries, two lives. And it shows us something uncomfortable. That genius doesn't always come with clarity. That the artists who break barriers often break themselves. That the price of being first is paid in private, long after the screaming stops. The album didn't vanish, but the man who made it did, at least for a while. And when he came back, he was never quite the same.